So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for those who are joining from this morning's 8 p.m. session. Welcome to RPRA's Circular Economy Learning Series event on understanding Ontario's producer responsibility regulatory framework. So my name's Cameron Perrick. I'm Manager of Programs and Stakeholder Relations here at RPRA, and I'll be the MC for your afternoon. So thank you for joining us, both the in-person and online audience. We're hosting over 140 people here at St. James Cathedral in the room today. We're also hosting 600 people virtually. So it's been nearly 4 years since we've had an event like this in person, and all of us at RPRA are really excited, the high level of interest from our stakeholders for this hybrid event. So many of you, I saw you earlier this week at the Circular Economy Summit, and there was a lot of great energy, a lot of really good ideas, a lot of positivity around the circular economy. And one of the key themes that I saw emerging was collaboration, and hopefully we'll talk about how all of our registrants and all the actors in the system can work to collaborate to create a circular economy here in Ontario, and really dig into some of the details with our panel discussion this afternoon. So we've got a really full agenda today, starting with our CEO, Frank Denton, is going to provide some opening remarks. Then, as I mentioned, we're going to follow up with a panel discussion on how the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Competition Bureau, and RPRA work collaboratively to oversight and implement and all the different roles they play in the producer responsibility framework in Ontario. So there will also be an opportunity for following the panel for audience questions, both in person and online, and we'll let you know momentarily how you can participate. So we're going to have a quick 15-minute break, followed by Mary, our registrar, Mary Cummins, is going to be delivering a presentation, as well as our Manager of Compliance and Strategy, Ellen White, on RPRA's approach to compliance, along with another opportunity to ask specific questions about RPRA's compliance approach. So for those in the room, if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and we'll have some of our mic runners, our RPRA staff, who will come over and offer you a mic to ask your question. And if you're online and you'd like to ask a question at any point during these different Q&A periods, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to type in your question and hit send. And if you have any technical issues, please email communications@rpra.ca. I'd also like to flag that we've got an upvote feature, so if you see a question that you really like and you'd like to have it moved up the queue, please like that question and we'll try and ensure we get to that. So last few housekeeping items just for those in the room. We've got washrooms located on the right-hand side, and the emergency exits are lit with the red exit signs in the case of an emergency. And then at the end, we're going to be gathering feedback on the delivery of this event. So those in person, you've got a QR code on your table to help capture your feedback, to help us improve our events. And those online, you'll see a survey near the end of the event. Okay, so I'm going to move right into our opening remarks from RPRA's CEO, Frank Denton.
Thanks, Cam. Hi again, everybody. I bet nobody came here this afternoon, who wasn't here this morning. Am I right? Probably. But I think there are some new people online. It's a big week for circular economy. I bet there's a bunch of people here who were at that Circular Economy Summit Monday, Tuesday, and now here for this. So thanks for your commitment. Something's happening in the world on circular economy, and we're really happy to be proud of it. I'll just speak for a few minutes about what we want to achieve today. Overall, the goal is to help everyone in the room gain a little bit better understanding of Ontario's producer responsibility, extended producer, individual producer, different terms, but fundamentally producers being financially and operationally accountable for what happens to the goods they sell into the market at end of life. Typically through a pro. I'm going to talk a little bit about our role. That came up a little bit this morning. It's complicated, right? We're maybe in the second half of what we want to think of maybe as a 10-year reform. 6 regulations in 3 years. I see my ministry colleague Charles O'Hara here, who I don't think he personally drafted every word, but that is a heck of an achievement for a policymaker to deliver that up to a government through all the politics and all the and all the stakeholdering to get something in place, which needs continuous improvement. I think Charles would agree with that. These aren't the final definitive regulations, but you'll hear what the objectives were in the way they were drafted. I want to talk a little bit about RPRA. So our core function, if you're here this morning, we keep hammering, we're here to help. We're here to communicate. We're here to serve the businesses that need to understand and find a way to come into compliance at lowest cost. And we're a regulator, right? At the end of the day, we are here to serve, and we are here to make those achieve highest possible compliance. We've done a number of teaching events like this over the years. The key learning objective, one of the key learning objectives that you can hear about today, is what's unique and different in Ontario and what's common to other jurisdictions. So every jurisdiction in Canada has some version of producer responsibility. Been around for years, right? We used to have the old Waste Diversion Act with the industry funding organizations. Now we have something different. So what's similar, what's unique? So the key things, it's maybe 3 things to think about that are different in Canada. And if you operate in multiple jurisdictions, or if you're used to another jurisdiction, or you're kind of still stuck in the ways of Ontario, keep these things in mind. We have a competitive pro market, right? So your pro is, as a producer, that's who you're most likely going to make a contract with and say, can you do everything, I'll pay you this money, and you do everything that needs to be done so that RPRA recognizes me as compliant with my obligations as a producer. Most jurisdictions, I think every other jurisdiction, it's a single pro market. And Ontario's coming out of a single or monopoly stewardship organization system, but it's different. Secondly, we're the only jurisdiction in Canada that has an actual, true, fully empowered regulator, right? I mean, we're here to help, and we're a regulator. So we've got all the powers that would be typically in a ministry. The government's policy choice was to put those powers in an arm's length organization, RPRA, rather than inside the Ministry of Environment. That was a policy choice. The third thing, and Mary's going to be talking about what that means in practice. The third thing I would say is different is Ontario has a system where it is required to provide accurate data on how much is supplied in and what happens to those goods at end of life. And we have a responsibility and an authority to verify that data through various procedures. I think Mary's probably going to talk some about that. That's unique to Ontario. So if you're working in other jurisdictions, you're used to other jurisdictions, operating on the instincts from other jurisdictions, at some point it's probably going to lead you astray. So call RPRA, and they'll help you understand it. The last thing I'll talk about before I turn it back to Cam is roles. There's been a degree of confusion, I would say, over the years. What's RPRA's role? What's the government's role? This Competition Bureau, how does that fit into all of this? And I'm really pleased that we have our Competition Bureau here today. So RPRA versus government. There's a Q&A about this morning if you were here. Who makes the law and who ultimately interprets the law? So as in every other regulatory program, the government, the state, makes the law, right? They pass legislation in the legislature, and then under that, cabinet makes regulations, which are the details. Then there has to be somebody to interpret it. That's RPRA. We're the regulator. We interpret it. So if you ever find yourself confused, well, my pro says the law says this, and RPRA is saying that, it's RPRA, right? There's only one interpretation. By definition, it's what RPRA says it is. We might get it wrong sometimes. There's an appeal process. And if you go, well, I went to government, or I thought the government said it was supposed to mean this, well, that was when it was drafted. That is when it went to cabinet. That's when it went to the legislature. And then it's no longer in the government's hands how it's interpreted. It's up to a responsible, rational, reasonable regulator to interpret the words on the page, right? And that's what RPRA does. And that's what the judge does, right? And there's appeal mechanisms. That's what that's what the CRA does. So it's the regulator. Whether the regulator is inside government or outside government, the regulator does that interpretation. So That's the government, and that's RPRA. What about RPRA and the Competition Bureau? I think you're going to hear about that later today. We have a role in competition. You hear Mary talk a lot about our objective of having a level playing field. A level playing field is about a competitive market that's fair, where people are playing by a set of rules that keeps that playing field level. But we're not the Competition Bureau. And so I'm really interested to hear the panel discussion about what the Competition Bureau does and what RPRA does. And why it is that Mary sometimes says, well, that's really, you got to talk to the Competition Bureau about that, not me. Then I want to lastly go into role distinctions within RPRA, because sometimes that has led to confusion. So think of three things. There's the board, there's me, CEO, and there's the registrar, right? The board is a governing board. It does what any typical board of a company does, broadly speaking, right? It gives strategic oversight. It gives strategic guidance. It sets strategy. It does oversight. It hires and fires the CEO. Also hires and fires the registrar. Haven't been any firings yet. So far, so good. But they don't make, but in addition, they make certain statutory decisions. They decide how the fees are going to be set on producers. That's one decision. They decide the steward obligation, which is how today in the old world, currently still in Blue Box, how much stewards, now in the new world called producers, have to pay municipalities to pay this, difficult to define 50% share of the current Blue Box program. So there's a very small set of statutory decisions they make. In other words, defined by the statute what they make, and all the rest of the statutory decisions that RPRA makes are made by the registrar, and that's Mary. I don't make those decisions. Mary makes those decisions. We have a very detailed reporting protocol. The board has an accountability for the registrar's overall decision-making. They've delegated that to me, right? So I manage Mary. I talk to Mary every day. Mary talks to the board whenever there's a board meeting. She gives an update and very detailed on what's happening in the markets, what's happening broadly, but not about specific compliance cases. And so from time to time, someone will say to me, I'm really concerned about something Mary did, or absolutely hate some decision that Mary made. I want to meet with you so you can fix it. And I'll say, I'm always generally happy to meet, to listen, because I'm interested in what people perceive about RPRA, but I generally won't meet if it's an active compliance case, and you will never hear me offering any opinion, positive or negative, about any decision Mary has made. Only the registrar or someone within her compliance team that she's delegated to speaks for the registrar. And similarly with the board. Sometimes the chair of the board will get a letter saying the registrar has done this crazy thing. Can you please fix it? They can't, right? It's not within their jurisdiction. So I just wanted to pause on that because it hasn't always been clear to everybody all the way along the way that there's important role distinctions within RPRA, important role distinctions between government and RPRA, and as we're going to hear in a few minutes, important distinction between the Competition Bureau and RPRA. And we're pleased to have, as we should, a collaborative relationship. Regulators should collaborate with each other. They should have open communication. But that's between the regulators. So those are my remarks. Thanks for coming out. I hope you find this worthwhile. And I'll turn it back to Cam. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Frank. So let's get the afternoon's proceedings kicked off here with our panel discussion. Before our panelists come on stage to have our discussion, we'd like to offer the opportunity for our panelists to provide a presentation. And we're going to start off with Charles O'Hara, who is the Director of the Resource Recovery Policy Branch at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. Following which, we're grateful to have Étienne Tremblay-Guérin from the Competition Bureau. He's a senior competition law officer who's going to also deliver a presentation to describe a little bit more about how the Competition Bureau interacts with our regulatory framework here in Ontario. And then we'll be followed by RPRA's Registrar, Mary Cummins, who's also going to deliver a presentation, following which we'll welcome everyone back on stage I've got a number of questions I want to ask them, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience and questions from both in person and online. So with that, Charles, you're up first. So welcome Charles O'Hara to the stage.
All right. Hello, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm joined by my colleague, Mark Peverini, who's in the back over there. Say hi, Mark. I did not draft 5 regulations, but Mark's team did. And so we're both here after, and if you have any questions during the break, please come and ask us. Sorry, can you hear okay? Good. All right. So I'll just maybe echo some of Frank's comments about the recent conference that just happened this week on the circular economy. There's definitely something happening on the circular economy globally. It's great here in Ontario that we're able to be sort of in the forefront of that and moving in that direction. Another thing that's happening this week that may be of interest is the Council for the Great Lakes, which is a nonprofit that sort of brings together governments and businesses around the Great Lake region, also has a circular Great Lakes initiative, which is looking at what are the regional opportunities in this circular economy? So whether it be in processing, whether it be in markets, whether that kind of thing. And of course, the American situation is very different than where we are today in Canada and Ontario. But that too is just an indication maybe of collectively where we're going and what the opportunities might be in the circular economy. So pleasure to be here today to talk about it. So what I'm going to say today may touch on many of the themes that Frank touched on already, but hopefully repetition in this case is good and gives you a slightly different perspective on that. So Ontario's approach to producer responsibility is different. It's an individual producer responsibility, which means that the legal obligation to comply is with the company, the brand holder, right? So it's not on the pro or the producer or the collective. I'll come back to that in a second. So what we've tried to do in that context is create a very outcome-based regulation, one that is driven more by regulations that specify what has to be achieved, not how you have to achieve it. And again, I'm going to come back to some of these in more detail. Producers have a choice. So Frank mentioned the competitive pro market that is unique in Canada and Ontario, but it's not unique globally. It means that producers have choices about which service provider, which producer responsibility organization they choose. In other provinces, these plans get approved. There's one pro and they create a plan and it gets approved by government. It's kind of locked in. Our experience in Ontario was that led to some rigidity that wasn't always welcomed by the entire producer community. Now there's outcomes. You choose a pro. If it isn't working for you, you can go look in the market for another pro. There's strong oversight. Frank's talked about that a little bit, so I won't dwell too long on that. And then a low burden, data-driven approach to compliance. And I'll come back to that a little bit more, but the registry that's in RPRA, when we consulted on the regulations, we really tried to make sure that the reporting requirements into the registry were as low burden as possible. In fact, what do we need as the regulator? What does the regulator need? What do we need as the government to know that compliance is happening, but also over time to know that the regs are being effective? So we tried to find the sweet spot in that regard. So in terms of the regulations, they're all quite different. They all have complexities, and so your first point of contact is to talk to Mary and the compliance team for sure about those regulations. But here's some high points. So who is the producer? Regulations set a hierarchy to determine the producer, and at the top of that hierarchy is the brand holder in Canada. So one of the things that has been well received, I think, nationally, even by peer jurisdictions, is the idea in the Ontario regulation that it's the brand holder resident in Canada. So that allows you to comply to get a producer even if they're based outside of the province. And then the first importer is the next one as well. So it allows us to get at producers who are not in Canada. So who is involved? Producer responsibility organizations, processor haulers. I have a graph on the next slide that gets into this a little bit better. What gets recycled? This is important, and it's an important role for RPRA too. Each regulation clearly defines the regulated materials. And as Frank said, the regulation goes so far, but it's RPRA's guidance and material on their website that tells you more detail about exactly what materials are obligated. For instance, in the blue box reg, 6 material categories. That's a lot of different products. So you need to talk to RPRA about which products are obligated. Producers are required to meet targets, and then it sets out what counts as diversion, when is recycling counted, what doesn't, landfilling, incineration. So all of that goes towards compliance. There's collection requirements. How is it collected? Each one's a bit different. The blue box is kind of unique. It sets a common collection system for the whole province. It says producers will cooperate on that one common collection system. That's about to start on July 1st, 2023. So a few short days from now, we're starting that transition. The other regs have more like a formula that says how many collection sites and what kind of collection sites do you need to put in place. And again, who is putting it in place? It's the producer, but it's the producer working with their pro. So usually it's a pro who's putting these things into place province-wide, and how they do it, though, is up to them. Of course, it's a flexibility in the market. And then how do we enforce? Again, this is RPRA and the registry. So I think we're going to hear more about the registry today, so I won't go too much into it. This is a diagram that we've used in developing the regs. It may be, I know we have a mixed audience here, so it may be familiar territory. But the producer is the obligated party in blue there. They report at the start of every year to the RPRA on their supply. And then RPRA assigns you your obligation based on the regulation. So how many tons of material are you going to have to report on managing? And then producer goes to the market. Now the producer could act individually at this point. Mary and RPRA can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think most producers, if not all, have gone and found a producer responsibility organization to help them meet those requirements, because it's hard to act on your own in this space and create all those collection requirements and get all the material that you need to meet your targets. And then that producer or pro reports annually on outcomes to RPRA. And I think the annual and the reporting, we're trying to keep the reporting low burden. We were trying to keep the reporting to a minimum. And so that's the framework that we've done to try to make that as simple as possible. The pro can report on your behalf if you're a producer. So once you've signed up with a pro and done that initial assessment of which pro you want to go with, they can do a lot for you. And then it starts to look a bit more like in other provinces where there's only one pro and you sign up and they do things for you. Here, though, you have to make that assessment about which pro you want to go with, and then they can do some of those annual reporting for you. So I think you've probably heard this morning, but and you heard it a bit in what Frank said. So these are the EPR regs that are in Ontario. Today, I won't really go into them in any more detail, but I'm happy to take any questions on any of the particular regs. So tires, batteries, electronics, hazardous and special products, and then blue box, which is just starting its transition. So the regulations are now finalized. Producer responsibility organizations are developing or have developed, right, the collection and system. Producers need to meet the requirements, register and report to RPRA, and service providers such as pros, haulers, and processors are really the ones on the ground doing most of the work. So in terms of the role of the ministry and the role of the regulator, I would certainly echo what Frank said. And so on this slide, we say the government's responsible for making legislation and regulation, communicating policy intent, and that's the one I just want to pause on, monitoring, implementation, and feedback. I would say in terms of policy intent, your first stop is RPRA. If you have a question about why is the reg like this, go talk to RPRA, try to understand the regulation. If you have once you understand that, if there's a further question about what the reg should be doing, you're thinking that the government needs to consider a different way of approaching collection, or the government needs to think about different materials to be collected. Those are policy changes. And I think if it's at that level that you might want to think about coming to talk to the ministry. But with such a strong regulator out front who has the obligation to interpret the regulation, your first stop really should be to RPRA if you have questions about the regulation. So we can talk about policy intent, the why of the act, of the reg, and then how they meet the policy or public interests of the government. But again, I do think that those questions are almost secondary to your first line. RPRA can also speak to those in the context of what you have to do today. So the role of RPRA is in overseeing the regulation, so providing guidance about the act and regulations, operating the registry, providing compliance and enforcement and regulatory requirements. And there, Mary can speak more to this, but there is a lot on the RPRA website that takes you, again, beyond 6 material categories that are obligated down to multiples and multiples of products that you produce or that you're responsible for managing. So that's an important, and how you report and all of that is with RPRA. So the RPRA does the who, what, when, and how, including definitions, procedural steps, timelines, etc. So that's sort of a 10,000-foot overview. Happy to take any questions on any of the regs, and we'll go from there. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Charles. And we'll roll right into Étienne's presentation from the Competition Bureau.
Hey everyone, pleased to be here. My name's Étienne. I work at the Competition Bureau in the Monopolistic Practices Directorate. I've been heavily involved in everything Ontario recycling related, and today I'll talk a bit about our role and what we do at the Bureau. But before I dive into any of that, I need to mention that all of what I say today, and especially my errors, should not be taken to reflect the views of the Commissioner of Competition or the Competition Bureau more broadly. So here's a bit of an agenda of what I'll be discussing today. Talk a bit about the Competition Bureau, our structure. Talk about what's an abuse of dominance. In more particular, what's the Section 79 of the Competition Act and the different criterias for Section 79 to be contravened. And hopefully what we can do today is help you guys understand a bit better what the Competition Act is all about. Gives us some tools to identify those situations, and hopefully you'll have a better sense of when to get in touch with us if you have any concerns with how the market is shaping out. So here's a bit of a kind of an overview of the structure of the Bureau. The Competition Bureau is an independent law enforcement agency in charge of enforcing the Competition Act. There are a number of sections to the Competition Act. We have like 4 of our enforcement branches here from cartels, looking at situations where competitors collude to fix prices. The deceptive marketing branch, where companies may engage in like a false or untrue advertising about their services. We have merger and acquisition review. And we also have the Monopolistic Practices Directorate, where we look at abuse of dominance or other forms of anti-competitive conduct, which is where I work. And on top of that, you also have the Competition Promotion Department, which will do some advocacy with regulators and such. So, knowing that there's a lot of regulatory changes happening in Ontario right now, some questions that raise like, hey, how does the Competition Act apply to Ontario recycling markets? The easy and very unhelpful answer is that it applies in the exact same way that it applies to every other market. But we'll go in deeper into what that means in terms of specifically the monopolistic practices part of our work, which is where I work. So the kind of elevator pitch for what's an abuse of dominance, which is covered by Section 79 of the Competition Act, which is by far the most commonly used section within the Monopolistic Practices Directorate. So the elevator pitch for what abuse is a situation where a dominant firm engages in conduct intended to harm competitors or competition more broadly, with the effect of impacting competition. Lots to unpack there, and I'll go over that in a minute. But I kind of think it's more helpful to start by talking about what's outside the scope of the Act and the types of situations that the Act is not engaged in. In particular, going a bit over what's a mere exercise of market power, as we call it in my line of work, versus what's an abuse of dominance. Because the concept of an abuse under competition law is not super intuitive. It does not have the same sense as the colloquial sense of an abuse. So an abuse of dominance is a situation where a firm that has market power is using that favorable position on a market to kind of press down on the scale of competition to protect their own position in the market. And it's doing so by harming its rivals or preventing its rivals' ability to compete with them. Whereas a mere exercise of market power is a situation where a firm, sure, might be dominant, might have a very favorable position in the market, and it just kind of cashes it in in a form of, for example, higher pricing. And an easy example of that is when the pandemic hit, prices for masks and hand sanitizers went up quite drastically. Received tons of complaints about that at the Competition Bureau. You can certainly make an argument for like consumer protection there, but that's not something that the Competition Act is equipped to deal with at all. If you think about a situation where competitors raise their prices knowing they're in a dominant position, is that affecting your rivals? Is that affecting your rivals' ability to compete with you? Probably not. You know, if anything, increasing your prices, it gives an opening for your competitors. So when we're thinking about conduct at the Bureau that could be an abuse, we're looking at situations that are more like exclusive or restrictive trade contract clauses, bundling products together and forcing, you know, your customers to buy everything with you. Obviously, threats of retaliation to your customers, your suppliers. These are all situations where that company who is perhaps dominant in that market, instead of just saying like, how I'm going to increase my prices, it's instead using that position to force customers to stay with them. And could that affect competitors? It could, right? If there's exclusive contract clauses such that competitors cannot like enter that market or expand, that's a situation where competition could be affected. So hopefully you can make a bit of a distinction on that, and I'll talk a bit more specifically about the framework. And the other point I want to make is that the Competition Bureau is not in the business of just dismantling large companies because they're big. Big does not mean bad in Canada. So, you know, the simple fact that a company has large market shares will never be kind of an issue for us. So this is the actual text of Section 79 of the Competition Act. It's very kind of legal and talk for hours about it, and I'll hopefully be able to do it in just a few minutes, going through some key points. So there's 3 requirements for it in the Act, in the Competition Act, for conduct to be contravening the abuse of dominance provision. All 3 needs to be met of those A, B, and C criteria, and also note that the Competition Bureau itself is not the entity that decides if conduct is contravening the Act. We actually make applications to it. Competition tribunal is ultimately the trier of facts. So criteria A, essentially that text has been interpreted by the courts to mean that a company is dominant. What does that mean to be dominant? Well, an economist could talk your ear off for hours about it, but just like to try to keep it more concrete. We're looking at very specific and concrete indicia of market power, such as market shares and barriers to entry. Market shares is said to be a safe threshold to be around 35%. With anything above that, could be indicative of market power and certainly a look at. With historically, Competition Bureau cases have been with industries where, you know, some dominant players having much more than that. And when we talk about barriers to entry, those can be regulatory. It can be a market where you need lots of scale to compete. It could be a situation where, like in social media, you have like network effects. It's very difficult to just kind of be a greenfield entrant in that market. And the combination of those 2 factors can be indicative of market power, which is a situation where a dominant firm can have that power over the market to kind of skew it in the direction they want. Criteria B is that this company that is said to be dominant is engaging in what we call the practice of anti-competitive act. Very broad and vague term. It can be pretty much anything because a practice of anti-competitive act has been defined by the courts by its intent. So it's a conduct that is intended to harm rivals or the process of competition. Bringing back to what I said a bit earlier, you know, you ultimately need to have like a specific conduct you can point a finger at and be like, this is what this company is doing to harm its rivals or to harm its competitors. So either it has the explicit intent of harming competitors, or it can also be said to like the obvious result is that it has an effect on competition, and it is kind of doing so without like a legitimate business justification. There's also tons of jurisprudence on that. A legitimate business justification refers to some like pro-competitive reason. We're just saying like, yes, I'm doing this, but it's positive overall for the market. That could mean to the act not applying in that case. So if a company is dominant and it's trying to harm its rivals, there's still a 3rd requirement for this, and it's to show that it is having an effect on competition. Of note here that I say an effect on competition, not an effect on a competitor. This has a very important implication that it's not sufficient to show that, if you're trying to compete in the market, it's not sufficient to show that it's having an effect on your bottom line, on your profits, right? We need to think about how this is affecting the market more broadly. And the easiest angle to kind of think about this is try to think of, if you're competing in a market, what is your presence in that market bringing to either your customers or your suppliers? Are you applying pressure down on prices? Are you innovating? Are you offering differentiated products such that your customers are benefiting from it? And that's the angle we care about, because ultimately the fact that you're making less money is not in and of itself something that at the Bureau we kind of care about, unless it can be shown that you kind of having fewer market shares, making less money will kind of lead to potential exit or lessened ability to compete and bring benefits to the market. So all of these three requirements need to be met for conduct to contravene Section 79. And I want to make a few observations about the Ontario market for pros, because we know regulation changed the market, and something that was brought a lot to our attention is that a lot of the legacy pro, the industry-funded organization, kind of led to them having a bit of a head start in those markets because of holding market shares from the previous regulatory framework. Well, I think it's important to underline that this is essentially just criteria A, right? A firm has market power. You still need to show that, if that company is engaging in conduct or it's having an effect on competition to really kind of show that conduct is contravening the act. And the extent to which an established company has established customer relationships in the market, has trust from the market for whatever reason, such that customers are kind of willingly and want to contract with that company, that's not an issue at all. So for us kind of focusing too much on kind of the initial state of the market, the initial structure of, this company as this, market shares is not a particularly fruitful path for us to go down in terms of our investigations, because, what's the conduct? That's what we care about. Point to us at a conduct. And ultimately, complaints that come in saying something along the lines of, hey, I'm trying to get into this market, nobody wants to be with me, to contract with me, and I make less money. That's very difficult for us to follow up on, right? What's the conduct, and how is this affecting competition? That's not something that you've highlighted to us. So these are a few observations about the market, and just understand that if you're ever talking to us in the forms of filing a complaint or something like that, always important to target a specific conduct. For us, it's important in these markets to let the dust settle, for competition to settle in among the pros. And once that's done, see if there's actual conduct happening in those markets that could prevent competition from kind of settling in and kicking in. I want to end with a few words about communicating with the Bureau. We are a law enforcement agency. What we do is we investigate. I'm just some random guy from Montreal with an econ degree. Everything I know about recycling is because someone in this room or attending virtually has told me about it. And engaging with market participants in the forms of calls or meetings or sometimes written requests for information, if it's more complex, it's the lifeblood of any investigation. Without it, we just can't conduct our investigations. So perhaps it's a bit of a self-interested pitch that if you see an email from me or one of my colleagues, please answer it. We're just trying to reach out to see if there's anything that we can do to help out the market. And if you're ever filing a complaint with us, you can do that either directly through the kind of official Competition Bureau website. It will most likely fall on my desk. And so you can reach out to me directly and just avoid 2 weeks of meandering in the system. So yeah, happy to do that. And keep in mind, a bit of the framework I said a bit about today, and really showing us, what's the conduct, what's the effect in your original complaint with us can really kickstart an investigation. Preventing, making so we don't have to dig as much to really kind of know what it is that we're looking into. So that was a bit of a breakdown of the Competition Act, and I know we'll have a panel later on to kind of highlight a bit more details about how we work with the RPRA, but hopefully that was helpful for people to understand a bit more our role at the Competition Bureau. So thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks so much, Étienne. That was really, really clear. I love that. Okay, so up next is Mary Cummins, RPRA's Registrar, who's going to continue the conversation, and then we'll head out to our panel discussion. Mary.
Hello again. Oh, look at that. That's so much better. I was having trouble with this morning. This works. Okay, so thank you for staying for the afternoon for those who were with us this morning, and welcome for those who have just joined us. So I'm going to try not to repeat too much about what you just heard here, but I want to talk a little bit more about what RPRA is. We are a unique framework for EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, but we are not unique. We have fellow regulators, administrative authorities. The idea that there is a registrar who makes statutory interpretations independently, who has compliance toolkits, can issue compliance orders, administrative penalties, prosecute, is not unique in Ontario. It's just unique for EPR. Here's some examples of like organizations to RPRA. Maybe you've interacted with some of them on different levels and different frameworks, depending on what industry you're in. All of these organizations are like RPRA. They have registrars, independent statutory decision-making power. The decisions can be appealed through tribunal, through courts. It's the exact same. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that concept, because I do get a lot of questions, confusion about RPRA's role, who we are, what we do, and it's really coming from folks who have an EPR background, and this is new to them. When I speak to someone in their organization who maybe had to work with TSSA, and I say, well, we're much like TSSA, it starts to click. So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that it's just unique to EPR. So as a regulator, though, what do we do, just to help you understand, because this is unique to EPR. So we're an administrative authority that can make compliance decisions, independent statutory decisions. You heard Charles talk about this. The regulations are written, policy intent is in there. Once they're written, once they're passed by cabinet, the policy intent, well, it matters to me in terms of making a statutory decision. What they wrote matters more. What does the law actually say? And I have to take a look at that, and my team has to take a look at that and make those decisions. We consult with legal. We do consult with the ministry. We ask questions. What was the policy intent? Sometimes what was written wasn't the policy intent. And that's where you might get this loop, this feeling of a loop, because RPRA says, well, you got to go talk to the government, and sometimes the government sends you back. Really what it is making sure that you understand there's a difference, right? If you're asking, Charles said it, if you're asking for a change, that's them. If you want to change what was written, I can't change what was written. That was passed by cabinet. They can propose those changes to be passed by cabinet. I can't. I can only interpret what is written. And that interpretation has bounds. I can't invent words that weren't there. I can't add an or where there's an end. So if those things happen, there's nothing I can do. And that's where you might hear us say, go talk to the government because you're looking for a change, right? And then sometimes you get to the government and they understand better and they say, actually, no, you need to go back to RPRA. So at this beginning stage, it might feel like a secular process and it might feel like we're ping-ponging you, but there's a process here in terms of what each of our roles are. We are accountable to the government. They created us. They gave RPRA our powers to be an independent statutory decision maker. We have an operating agreement with them. Requires transparency, requires particular plans to be developed, us to adhere to frameworks. They appoint our board, 5 members of our board. They have a ministerial observer at every single one of our board meetings. So we are accountable to them. But we are responsible for interpreting, communicating, and enforcing their regulations. What they wrote, not what they meant. But at the same time, we obviously care about what they meant. So we read what we hear what they meant, we read what they wrote, we get legal interpretation, and we make these decisions. We are funded not through a tax base. We are independent. So if I make a decision or one of my compliance officers makes a decision, and it's a particular compliance case, so it could be about a particular individual producer, or it could be something affecting a whole bunch of producers, or a pro, or a service provider. Government can't intervene. We are an independent statutory decision maker. They are not allowed to come to me or any member of my team and say, I don't think you should be taking this action on this producer, or I don't think that this is the right way to do this case. They're not allowed to do that or play that role. We are independent from them and not funded by them. And you heard Frank talk about this earlier too. Same with the board, same with Frank. Frank runs our operations. He can't tell the team how to interpret something or what action to take. So we're isolated for a reason so that we can play this role, independent statutory decision maker. Few notes, what we do not do. I think we've got this point across. We didn't write the regulations. We don't determine policy. Often on a regulation that's being amended or regulations out there, some people will ask RPRA, well, what do you think? I don't have an opinion on the policy. All I do is enforce what they told me to enforce. We do not arrange for the actual collection. So a lot of confusion there too. We hear frequently from folks, but I register with RPRA, I'm good. No. You're registering with RPRA so that we can tell you as a producer what your obligations are. Then you have choice, as Charles said, to go out there and figure out how to meet the obligations. That's where pros come in. We do have individual producers who meet their obligations without pros. I think in almost every regulation. So we do have folks who figure out how to do it on their own, but ultimately the vast majority go out and contract. It's a private business contract, right? Let's just move forward to, I don't think we actually have the slide on that. It's a private business contract between you and a pro. Something I've been saying a lot to producers lately. What multi-million-dollar contract do you enter into and then not follow up on deliverables? This is a private market negotiation. You're contracting with a pro to perform a service for you, and it is incumbent on you to then make sure they're delivering that service. Because at the end of the day, individual producer responsibility. You are the ones, the producers are the ones with the accountability for this. Service providers play a huge role in this process. They too have obligations under these regulations. They have obligations to report to RPRA. They have obligations, some of them, to meet certain efficiency standards. We talked about that a little this morning. But ultimately, they also have some role, some obligations in this regulation. All of it, though, feeding in so that RPRA is able to perform the compliance and enforcement function of the whole framework. And then the last thing, although this is a little bit of an old point, we don't get this question as much, we also don't set or regulate anything to do with how a producer recovers their costs. There are costs for doing business in Ontario. Those costs range from environmental compliance with this regulation to rent. There are tons of different costs. How a private company wants to charge those costs, recover those costs, do anything with it, not RPRA, and not our role to tell them what to do, nor is it our role. So if a consumer calls us and says, is this fee accurate? I don't know. Was the cost accurate? I'm not sure of that either. You have to go talk to the producer who charged it to you. So I'll end on that note just because I think we want to make sure we leave lots of time for questions, and I don't want to overlap too much with what already has been said.
Okay, thanks so much, Mary. So I'd like to invite our speakers up for a panel discussion. So Etienne and Charles, come on back up to the stage. So one mic each, yeah. Go ahead, Charles. Okay, so I've got a bunch of questions, and we're going to leave lots of time for audience questions as well. But let's dig right in. So let's start off with a high-level question, then I'll go more granular, more producer and service provider focused. But let's start off with a foundational question. So many other jurisdictions are watching Ontario's new framework, and some are trying to understand whether this model would work in their jurisdiction, especially the competitive pro model. From each of your unique perspectives, can you speak to the benefits of fostering a competitive marketplace for pro services? And maybe we start with Charles on this one.
Sure. Okay, great. Thanks. I forgot my sunglasses. I can't see anyone. I hope you get. So I'm going to talk a bit about it from the policy perspective, I think. Mary may talk a bit about what she's seeing in the market today and some of those benefits. But why did we create a competitive pro system in Ontario? So we had many years of experience with industry-funded organizations or stewardship organizations, all versions of the same thing, which is a government-approved or mandated monopoly. So there was one organization that all producers had to join and be part of, and collectively that organization was responsible for meeting the diversion targets and the outcomes in the regulations. What we had over a number of years' experience was government facing questions about, the operation of that one organization that everybody had to be part of. And government didn't feel that we're in the best position to answer those operational decisions. So we didn't want to be put on that place. And then related is a lot of questions about fees and costs. And again, we're not operating it, the stewardship organization is operating it, so this didn't strike us as a conversation or a question for government. And so by creating a competitive system, the intent is to put it back in producers' court to make a choice about what service provider they're going to work with, give them the choice to move, give pros the ability, the outcomes are in the regulation. Producers and pros know what they have to achieve, how they approve it, so operationally it's up to them. It can shift all the time without coming back to government and asking for a change, which we had sometimes in the old framework. Small changes were locked into a plan and they would have had to come back to government and seek ministerial approval for a change. Too rigid, right? So, and then fees as well. We've left that to the market to decide on fees. And again, in a competitive market, hopefully there's choice that people see in those fees. So those were some of the policy rationale. And I would say that in all the cases, we did the regulations through a fair bit of consultation with stakeholders and tried to structure the outcomes in a way that they were low burden. So again, as much flexibility into that market as possible and as little prescription in the reg as possible.
Thanks, Charles. So that spoke to the intent. Now, Mary, do you have any thoughts on the benefits we're seeing in the implementation phase with the competitive pro marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of businesses in this room, and I'm just going to pose a question. Would you prefer acquiring a service where you have to join one company and that is it? You have no choice. Or would you prefer being able to negotiate and figure out the services that fit best your business needs? I think that's what we're hearing a lot from producers as this is rolling out in terms of what they enjoy about the competitive pro marketplace. It also helps mitigate your compliance risk. When you have multiple pros in a marketplace, you are able to pick the one that fits the risk for your compliance needs best. Maybe it's a smaller pro. Maybe you're a smaller business with smaller risk. So maybe that works really well for you. Whatever might work well to service your compliance needs and mitigate that risk. If it's just one option, that's when your risks increase. Just a natural thing that happens when you're dealing with a compliance framework.
And Étienne, I want to give you an opportunity because you might have some thoughts about competition.
Yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the Competition Bureau, we love competition. And, some, kind of thinking about that is like, I think a lot of people think of competition, they think about like price wars and like, oh, I have competitors and need to reduce my price. And the actual kind of benefits of competition is much more than that. Like having a competitor that constrains how you do business, how you price, is something that actually has lots of benefits on reducing costs. Now, companies have to reduce costs to reduce their prices they charge. And this is something that leads to the market operating much more efficiently than when companies are just like, hey, I don't have competitors, like I don't have to reduce my costs, I don't have to think too much about this. And this leads to kind of sometimes can be a very lengthy process of companies that can't adapt to this, can't reduce their costs, can't operate efficiently. At some point can leave the market, be replaced by other companies. and hopefully kind of trusting the process that this will lead to kind of a much more efficient outcome from everyone in the market, and obviously resulting in lower prices and lower costs for some of the producers can be sitting in this room to meet their regulatory requirements of recycling products.
Okay, thank you. Now, we heard about each of these, your organizations that you're representing, your individual roles, but I want to learn more about the collaboration. So maybe we'll start with Étienne. How does the Competition Bureau work together with RPRA? When do you interact? What triggers an interaction?
So I did not talk too much about this at the beginning of my presentation, but we have a whole branch called competition promotion, or sometimes we call it advocacy, who they basically advocate. So this is an entire branch whose work is to get in touch with regulators and legislators to, perhaps bring a bit of expertise relating to competition, make some suggestions about how to implement or draft legislation. Sometimes they will invite us to speak, and sometimes it's just public consultation, and we'll just kind of reach out proactively. I work in the enforcement branch, meaning I'm an investigator. I investigate to see if conduct is contravening the act. And when I do that, I kind of take the regulatory framework as granted. Like, it is what it is. If I investigate in a file, it's not the right time or place for me to give a call to Mary or Charles and be like, hey, I think there's an issue with this part of the regulation. That's not how it works. We will still work quite collaboratively with the RPRA, and I'm happy to say that it's been great. We've been in many calls with Mary over the time, and it's mostly just to ask about how the market works, understand how market works, and in some sense, like I said earlier, this is the lifeblood of cases, understanding how the regulation, understanding how all of that interacts with one another. And if opportunities come where we can pitch in and provide some of our expertise about some of what those regulations, how that could affect competition, how to draft regulation that fosters competitive environments, we will absolutely jump on the occasion to work collaboratively with RPRA or ministries for that purpose.
And Mary, any thoughts?
I would just say I think the Competition Bureau and RPRA work together much the same way RPRA works with any other fellow regulator. So we speak a lot to any regulator, whether that's BC Ministry of Environment, because their regulation and enforcement of it is in-house, or ARMA, who is being formed in Alberta to be a regulator. We have, or we see Quebec. In Quebec, we have these interactions, we have conversations. To Étienne's point, how does it work? What's actually happening? Conversations to learn from each other and how to move things forward. So I think it's a collaboration.
Okay. Now I'm going to jump down a level to the producer, a more producer-focused question. So why does Ontario, and this is for Mary, why does Ontario need a registry operated by RPRA? Why can't I just report to a pro?
All right, so I think this question came up this morning too, and I think there's a few components to it. The first is you're reporting to RPRA as a producer, so we can tell you what your obligation is, so that you're then going out and getting services from a pro to help you meet that obligation. If you weren't doing that component with RPRA, you would be going in a private marketplace to someone who will tell you what the obligation is, what service you need from them, and the price. That doesn't make a lot of sense. You come to RPRA, we are the ones with the statutory decision-making power. We are the ones that can tell you if you're obligated or not obligated. We are the ones who can tell you what materials to include and what not to include under the regulation that will then actually drive what your obligations are. So now you've got what you need to buy. You know what services you need from an independent party who has the power to stamp it and say, that's what you need to do. Then you're gonna go and negotiate to get those services. It wouldn't make sense to do that all from one party. It just doesn't work very well. The second component is because of RPRA's role overall. We have visibility into the entire EPR framework. So that's haulers, processors. I said it this morning, supply data is the very foundation upon which Ontario is able to track our success towards a circular economy. RPRA needs all of that information in order to report on, in our public performance requirements of reporting, the success for the circular economy. It's also our main compliance tool. So with it, we're able to track this information, figure out who's in, out of compliance, have those conversations and interactions. So it is a really important tool, and it's also required by law.
Thanks, Mary. We hear that question a lot, so I wanted to make sure with this audience that we got a clarification. So back to a question about competition. So in Ontario, with the opportunity for competition for pro services, we're seeing large pros and small pros operating within the APR programs. What are some of the considerations that market-dominant pros and their clients need to be aware of so they do not contravene the Competition Act? So Étienne, maybe you can weigh in on this one.
Yeah, so, well, one thing to say is, like, I'm not here to give legal counsel, and something we always recommend firms to do, especially firms that may have large market shares, is to make sure that they hire competition counsel that will be able to give them much more personalized and clear guidance on whether their business practices are working well, if they are inside or outside of the Competition Act. And I think I explained a bit about, that our framework a bit earlier. I think that a kind of easy question you can ask yourself that can give you a bit of a hint is just to wonder, like, hey, let's say you have like lots of customers, you have large market shares in the market. Try to ask yourself, is it because you're offering better services or lower prices, or is it because of other reasons that you're having such large market shares? Are there contractual clauses? Are there, would your customers want to get out if they could? And answering those questions can maybe give you a hint as to whether or not what you're doing is falling outside of the Competition Act. It's contravening the Act, but obviously it always referred to Competition Counsel to help you get some guidance on your business practices.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if others have thoughts, but I think that was pretty specific to Étienne. Okay, as a service provider, can I be asked to work exclusively for one pro? Maybe we start with Mary and then go to Étienne, or do?
Yeah, I respond that in the sense that I'm not going to respond to a question like that. If somebody came to me and asked me that question, my role as a regulator is not to regulate the market. The provincial interest requires me to have due regard for competition in my decision-making and my team's decision, but it is not my job to oversee that market or those contractual relationships. I would probably pass it over to the Competition Bureau. Not physically to that person, but as in he's up here right now, so he may want to respond to it.
Yeah, so I wish I was able to answer that question easily, but as I kind of alluded a bit earlier, Competition Act, in particular civil provisions of the Competition Act, and I think there's a bit of distinction to make here between civil and criminal conduct, such as cartels. In this forum here, I'm talking about civil provisions of the Act, such as abuse of dominance. They're always dependent on effects. So I'll never be able to give a blanket answer. It'll always depend on the circumstances. Exclusive contract clauses is one of the most common thing we look at in the Monopolistic Practices Directorate, because it's also one of the most common thing you see in pretty much any market. And the reality is that in many situations, exclusive contract clauses are okay. So a few questions you need to ask yourself if exclusive contract clauses are contemplated or part of your contractual practices is, one, does the market need these exclusive contract clauses to kind of work and make sense? Sometimes they do. Sometimes you need to know volume. You need to have certainty on the long term to invest or do other types of business activities. And these are situations where exclusive trade contracts could be okay. The second question you have to ask yourself is, are these exclusive clauses actually harming competitors or preventing my competitors from successfully entering or competing in that market? And the reality is that there's lots of markets where there's exclusives. I have an exclusive with this company, but if there's enough contestable market, then it's not an issue. If you start to see very broadly apply exclusive trade contracts, such that many service providers or customers are starting to get locked up behind it, and now you're a new entrant, it's like, well, everyone's locked up. Like I can't get a foothold in this market. Nobody can do business with me because they're locked up behind exclusive contracts. These are situations where it can be an issue under the Competition Act. But again, it all depends on the facts. So it's a kind of case by case thing. And I don't know if this was kind of implied in the question, but I still want to mention that if you are a service provider and a pro is offering you a contract with exclusivity, I just want to underline that. It's very unlikely that as a service provider, you would be found kind of responsible for that under the Act. So don't kind of be too concerned from that angle. But if that's something you don't want these contract clauses, you want to be able to do business more freely with other market participants, feel free to reach out to us at any time. This is the type of things that we're always happy to discuss.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now a more producer-focused question. So as a producer, who do I complain to if my pro is charging fees that are too high? Maybe start with Mary or Charles. I'm not sure.
I already answered, I think. Oops, is that in?
Maybe turn it on and off for us now.
Oh, sorry, there you go. I think I answered that in the policy outcome. We wanted to move that to the producer community, right? It's a market relationship. If you don't like the fees, we're hoping that there's pros out there that offer you a different fee offering. And so it's a competitive market. And so there should be choice in fees, ideally. So.
And then I'll respond to it from RPRA's perspective, because we do hear that question a lot. I don't like the terms my pro is offering. How do I know my pro is financially viable? I don't like these fees. What would you do if you're going into business with anyone else? You're going to ask if they're financially viable, if they can actually provide the services for you. You're going to negotiate the contract, and you're going to figure out what works best for your business. This is a free market now, and in terms of that negotiation, just like any other vendor, you as a business are going to negotiate with. So negotiate on what you can. But RPRA does not approve pros. We have no oversight over their financial ability. We're not going in there saying they can or can't meet your obligations. It's incumbent on you to figure that out. The same way when you enter into a contract with any other vendor your business enters into a contract with, you are checking that they can actually meet the deliverables. Maybe you're checking references. I don't know. You're doing everything you need to do as a business to be satisfied before you enter into that contract. Once you enter into that contract, I don't know that any business would say, they're good now, right? I don't need to follow up with them. No, you're going to make sure they're hitting the deliverables of that contract for you. This is now an arrangement between you, private business arrangement, and another company. So you would treat it the exact same way.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to shift a question away from competition to one on harmonization, because I know that's something we hear about a lot. So many large producers that operate nationally have expressed frustration about the lack of harmonization across Canada's different EPR frameworks and the additional costs that poses. How can greater harmonization be facilitated between the various provincial EPR programs? Perhaps we'll start with Charles.
Sure. So all the provinces are part of something called the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, and all the EPR regs in Canada are environmental regs in their first instance, although they have a lot of, as you're hearing this morning, as you know from your businesses, a lot of economic aspects to them. So it's in that venue that we talk to other provinces. The ministers have directed something, have all agreed to pursue something called the Canada Action Plan for Zero Plastic Waste. And in that there's a commitment around looking at EPR and what needs to be done to harmonize EPR in Canada. And I would say that the stage that conversation is at right now is identifying where are the opportunities for harmonization. And I mentioned in my presentation things like the definition of a producer. It's at that level that harmonization, I think, is going to start to happen. It's knowing that if you're obligated in Alberta, you're also obligated in Ontario. So you have this consistent obligation. Other things that that guidance points to is things like definitions of materials, definitions of things when things are recycled. So we've heard that message from producers. I think right now in Ontario, our focus is on implementing the regulations that we have right now and making sure those get off the ground. As Frank said, this is a big shift. There's a lot of change going on, and but that's not to say that we're not attuned to that need, and we're not talking to other or listening to other provinces and trying to figure out, governments need to decide when is the point that regulatory change would be done to harmonize kind of at that level, so that you would know that if you're working in Alberta, your obligations are measured in the same way or whatever as they are in Ontario. So having said that, though, I would also say that there's already a lot of commonality between the frameworks. They're all reporting supply, they all have targets, they all have pros. One of the largest blue box pros in Ontario, Circular Materials, has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with a large pro in Quebec, EEQ, to share on implementation and reduce costs where they can in the future. So, there's an example of where in the market too, there's efforts already looking at how to harmonize across the country. So I think it's a long-term game, but it's certainly on everybody's radar.
And so that's from our policymaker. Now, Mary, what can we do at RPRA? What's within our power to harmonize?
So things in our power to harmonize are anything that's within RPRA's authority or mandate. So registry procedures are an example of something I spoke about this morning. A registry procedure could be, here's how a producer determines their supply data. Here is how they determine what's in, what's out, how it's calculated. If you're a national producer selling into all of Canada to retailers, what's a formula that you can utilize to determine your sales? Those are areas where we could talk, and we do talk to our fellow regulators to say, can we harmonize that, whether it's in their legislation or whether it's with a pro who's making that determination, so that we can try to harmonize across the different jurisdictions. I think part of what the problem is fundamentally with this desire to harmonize is one jurisdiction puts out a policy on EPR. So Charles puts out a policy on EPR. Other jurisdictions look at it and they say, okay, well, this is working, we want to improve this, and our policy intent's a little different. So you'll see them build on make improvements, a continuous improvement. So I think there's areas where we can have multiple small wins to harmonize, but as an overall principle, it's difficult to do because each jurisdiction wants to make improvements on what already exists. But on things like definitions, terminology, how to verify, how to report, how to audit, those are things where I think there is movement that can happen.
Thanks, Mary. So I think that's the end of my canned questions. So we're going to open up to the audience here in the room as well as online, and I'm going to try and rotate back and forth between live questions and the ones we received through the Zoom chat. So just a reminder, if you have a question, we're going to try and keep those questions to questions about our roles, each of our roles, keeping in mind that this afternoon we're going to be talking about RPRA's compliance and enforcement approach, so maybe holding those questions for later this afternoon. So if you're here in person and you'd like to ask a question of the panel, please just raise your hand and one of our RPRA folks will walk a mic over to you. And if you're online, please use the Q&A function to type in your question, hit send, and we'll see them here and they'll be forwarded on to me. And if you'd like to upvote a question, just hit the like button on a question and move it up the queue so we make sure we answer it. We're probably not going to be able to answer all the questions, especially online, but we'll do our best. Okay, I saw someone raise. We got a few hands already. Oh, and sorry, please say who you are and who you represent. That'd be helpful for us.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Schmalinsky, and I'm from RLG. We have a variety of roles in this space, but we are also a third-party compliance firm helping producers report and remit environmental handling fees. So my question is to Étienne. We noted federal interest and investigations on the topic of junk fees and drip pricing. And for our clients and the larger community of producers' sake, we would like to better understand what a junk fee is and what drip pricing is. Are you able to outline what these terms mean and if they are applicable to the sector's environmental handling fees?
So these are concepts under the deceptive marketing branch, and I'm unfortunately not in the best position to address this. The concept of drip pricing is essentially to post my understanding of it is to post a price that, once you kind of peel back the layers, it's actually not that price you're being offered as a buying that product. It can be said to be contravening the deceptive marketing provisions of the Competition Act, where you can't make false or misleading advertisement. And if you want to know more about that, I'd recommend you reach out to the Competition Bureau, and perhaps I could put you in touch with some colleagues within that department. That's not something I deal with on a regular basis, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Étienne. I'm going to field a question here from our online audience. So, why is my company held responsible when I hire a pro to do all the work for me? If I don't meet my target, or if my pro doesn't meet my target, or the collective target of all the pro's clients, is RPRA going to come after me with an administrative penalty against my business, even if it's not my fault? So maybe that's one for Mary.
Yes, so our statutes, the policymakers have made a decision that these regulations and statutes are something called absolute liability. So what that means is it doesn't really matter if you've done everything in your power. It doesn't matter if you thought you even took action like signing up with a pro and you thought that pro was going to do everything to make you compliant. You either are compliant or you're not compliant. What we do in response to potential non-compliance with our compliance framework, we're going to talk about this afternoon, because that is where it becomes relevant, but nothing will change. It's black and white. You either are compliant or you are not compliant. This is an individual producer responsibility framework. The responsibility is on the producer, not the pro. There are some components of each of the regulations where there is a shared liability with the pro, mostly around collection networks. But ultimately, it's the individual producer's responsibility. So signing up with a pro and coming to RPRA and saying, but I signed up with a pro, you are still accountable. You either are or aren't compliant. The action we take as a result of that depends on the facts of the circumstance. So what did you do to try to be compliant might actually change your response for that non-compliance from RPRA. But you're still non-compliant.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I'd like to turn it back over to the in-person audience. We got a question right here.
My name is Shabir, and I'm from Loblaw. My question is around Blue Box, which is destined to be the largest program. So under the Blue Box program, almost about 60% of the cost is for the common collection system, and also the rules on providing service to Ontarians is also around the common collection system. So that leaves only about 40% of the cost that can be controlled or not. Now, taking the admin cost and everything out of it, so there leaves a very little wiggle window with the pros. So what are the major benefits that we see in the competitive market, given that there is a little wiggle window available after the common collection system is done?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I think there's two aspects to that, two or three, I guess. The first thing I would just say is that, so pros are required, producers under the Blue Box regulation are required to collect from every single resident or obligated source in Ontario. And everyone has to do that. So that's what drives the cooperation that you speak to. So no one could do that on their own effectively, and so by result, everybody works through their pros to figure out how to do that collectively or cooperatively, I guess would be the word I would say. So the regulation then further specifies that that the pros will submit a plan, which they have done to RPRA, that says how they're going to work together. And it's my understanding that in that plan is a pro governance table that they decide collectively how they're going to run that common collection system. So I guess I would say that it doesn't strike me in that model that this 60% is sealed from efficiencies. In fact, I think there's opportunities within that competitive pro framework. There's 3 pros now in the Blue Box. they should be discussing how to make that as efficient as possible and what it needs to look like in order to drive performance, which is exactly what they're doing. So I don't think that 60% is sealed from cost savings. The other thing is that you're taking 250 programs and you're making one common collection system. And in that is the opportunity, we think, for efficiencies or for scaling, how many transfer facilities you're going to need, how many MRFs are you going to need, all that kind of stuff. So, so that's the first thing. Then, you know, the 40% is still there for competition, right? So there's opportunities on that front too, in terms of, I think two things. One, for sure, it's processing costs. So what are different offerings for people? I'm also hearing about interest that producers have in access to the material on the back end, which is something that people can compete on, right? So the material that's collected out of the common collection system, if you want it back because you have a circular business model, is your pro willing to help you with that? And is that a point of competition? So I think there's room for competition throughout the whole chain, I would say.
And I would just add, we're 10 days out to the transition start, which is a 3-year period. There's requirements on pros during that transition period to maintain things. Come 2026, producers and their pros are given keys to that kingdom, if you will, in terms of collection. And I think you'll see a lot of changes where pros are coming up and saying, let's find more efficiencies. Right now, during this transition, things are a little bit more rigid because it's trying to protect the consumers, trying to make sure the resident gets this seamless transition. I think you'll find that there'll be a lot of things that the pros are talking to producers about for 2026 around that collection system.
Okay, I'm going to turn to our online questions. I've got quite a few about pros. This is good transition. So here's a policy question. Maybe Charles can start, and then maybe the others can pile in. So if the intention was to have many pros and create competition, why are there so few pros to choose from?
So I don't know about the so few. I guess that's the thing that you have to say. Yeah. So it depends on the regulation. Like in the blue box, there's 3 pros. You know, the latest 12 in electronics. So, and I think when it comes, like when I think about this question, I think I revert back to it's a producer's choice, right? So, you know, why are there multiple pros? Well, why have producers chosen to go with different pros? So I think that is a question that, you know, producers can ask peer producers and understand what's happening. But the fact that there's a large pro in a lot of the markets and then there are small pros means that for some producers, there's benefits in that choice. And that was the policy intent, right? It's giving people that choice. And so how much that choice is taken up and how much that choice is needed or wanted by producers, I think is reflected in each of the markets.
I'm going to go for another online question because I got one related to competition and pros. So competition works in densely populated areas, but how will it work in less populated areas and smaller communities? For example, the North and in Western Ontario. Or I guess Northwestern Ontario, sorry.
That's something that I think is a very interesting question, actually. So, you know, you think about this regulation, and I try to think of like, it's a very interesting question to see, how do you draft regulation that tries to mimic or create a market where incentives to compete are that similar of that you would find in a more traditional market, where the reasons where companies are doing that economic activity is just because there's money to be made. That's a different type of situation here, where as a society we made the decision that recycling should happen. There's regulation that forced that, and that's something that, you know, we are aware that sometimes regulation requiring the collection network to be happening in these kind of like more less density of population is something that requires a certain amount of like collaboration between competitors to kind of establish that collective network, and that's something we are kind of aware of. And, we understand that it can be a little difficult, where it's the line between, hey, I'm on the phone with my competitor to divvy up some territory, when is it okay and when it is not. And I certainly encourage, firms to be in touch with, Mary and to kind of help with kind of, putting that in place.
Are we good from the panel?
I'm good. I think that was
Okay.
great.
Okay. So I've got a question from a producer, and I'm gonna add two questions here. So the first is, I'm a producer that was contacted by a pro, not listed on RPRA's website. Am I allowed to contract with them if they're not on your website? And then I guess a follow-up question is, does RPRA vet pros?
So if they're not on our website, that's fine. The fact that they're on our website right now is because they've chosen to be. So a company is coming to us and saying, I want to be a pro. Can I please go onto your website so that my name is out there? But technically, under the law, they only become a pro 30 days after they've contracted with a producer. So you could definitely have a company come to you and say, I'm trying to be a pro, but before I go out there and do it publicly, I want to get some customers. That's okay. The regulation allows that. They don't become a pro till 30 days after they sign that first contract. And it could perfectly be possible that they just, before they actually go out there and put their name all over the place that they're going to be a pro, they're talking to some people to say, is there supply and demand for me to be a pro? And that's fine. You only become a pro once you've contracted with a producer. Now, we don't vet any of these companies. Somebody comes to us and says, I don't have a single producer, but I want to be a pro. Can you put me on your website as a pro? Sure. That's pretty much the process. Once they sign up with a producer and they come to us and say, I'm actually a pro, because a producer has selected them as their pro in the portal, they do come to all pro meetings. They get access to some information to help their producers comply. But again, we didn't vet them. We assume you did because you're the one contracting with them. So we're assuming you're contracting with them because they can deliver on what you've contracted for. That's where we stop.
So Mary, what can a producer do to understand which pros they should be contracting with? Can they call RPRA and maybe ask, well, what should I be looking out for in the marketplace?
Absolutely not. We won't be able to help you with that. That's like saying, can I call the CRTC to see if I should pick between Bell and Rogers? They're not going to answer that question. What you could do, though, you have trade associations. They can talk a little bit more freely to you about what you should be looking for in a pro. We can talk to you about what you should be looking for, period. So we can say, you should be looking for someone who can establish a collection system for you. We can tell you what your obligations are to therefore translate that to a pro so that you know what you need, but we're not going to tell you whether a pro can meet that service or not. That's your job to determine.
Okay. Now I'd like to turn it back to we've got a lot of questions. Okay, so over here on this side of the room.
Thank you for speaking with me earlier, but I have a follow-up question. We're a small producer. My name is Ashwin, representing Canadian Down and Feather Company. We have to engage with these pros, and we sort of talk about we're in a private market system where if you deal with another private business, well, you know what you're getting, and you know how to vet that company, and you can make a free market capital markets decision to make the best choices. But we don't have the information to be able to make these choices. We don't know what we're looking for. We don't really understand what these obligations are. You're saying, hey, we need to do education, we need to do processing, we need to do all these things. We have no idea about that. We have no set of skills to be able to negotiate with the pros to be able to do any of this. When you say, hey, you have Bell and you have Rogers, I know exactly what I'm getting. I'm getting a cell phone that makes phone calls, and I know exactly what that is. I know what I should pay for it or what I can afford to pay for it. I can hold them responsible. If they don't give me what I'm asking for or what I'm expecting, well then I can take action against them. I can change companies. We don't know what we're looking for. And I've been through the website 100 times. We have our entire team watching from our office. I have people here who are also small producers, and we're not getting answers, and it's not fair. I was told that, hey, you know what? This is mostly for the larger producers for now, but I'm obligated to do this by law today. And so I need an answer today because I have to register and I have to pay fees and I have to contract with the pro by July 1st, and I should be able to get answers. The reason I'm here today is because I'm not getting answers. And you guys are up here telling us what you guys cannot do. You're not telling us what we should do, how we should do it. And I don't think that this is fair, and I think you're failing all of us here. All the big producers here know exactly what they're doing. They have teams of people, they have lawyers. We don't have that, and this is not a fair system right now.
So I will respond to that because I think you and I chatted during the break, and I know there are some producers online trying to figure out what to do. It starts with your obligation. So registering and reporting to RPRA, that'll tell you the first step of what you need to do. Once you know that, and it may come back at the end that you have no obligation. So make sure you look at that page. It will literally tell you if you are too small of a producer to even need a pro, right? That's the first step. Some of you will have hit that stage, right? That you can look on the portal and we can help you do that. It'll literally say no obligations. So some of you fit into that bucket. If it does have obligations, like I just said, we can walk you through, right, in terms of what it is that you're looking for from a pro to provide the services on, because what is it that you need to comply with? But ultimately, you still have to do some of this on your own to figure some of this out in terms of what you're going to contract for and what you're willing to cover for. Right now, RPRA, and we'll talk about this as well, our risk-based compliance framework. Yes, we use a risk-based compliance framework that focuses on the highest tonnage first. So the smaller producers may not be getting, if you've got an obligation to recover a very small portion, and we're going to talk about all of this in a later panel about how that works, we have to focus. There are thousands of registrants and not very many of us. So we have to focus on the larger first and work our way through to help everyone. And we will get to everyone and make sure everyone's helped, but it is a process.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Some more questions from the room. Maybe Simon over there, Monica.
Great, thank you. I'm Simon Kinsman from the Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association. I had a question about the RPRA model and its governance. So one of Mary's slides had said that RPRA is one of 10 or so delegated regulators in Ontario. The following slide noted that RPRA's board has no stakeholder representation, but each of those other 10 delegated authorities do have stakeholders represented on their board of directors. Can you speak to what sets RPRA apart in that regard?
So I can probably let Charles respond to some of that as well in terms of the government's decision in terms of how RPRA's board is structured, because that's actually in the Act, so that's not something RPRA determines. The statute tells us how our board is composed. But no, not all DAAs have stakeholder representatives on their board. It may have been those examples, but there, I think, are 37 administrative authorities. I just picked the ones that I felt like people in this room might know in terms of their interaction, like RHRA, retirement home. They were kind of in the news a lot recently. OMVIC, if you buy a new car, you might. So I tried to pick ones you might know. I didn't pick ones based on stakeholder representation on the board, but absolutely not. Not all regulatory authorities have stakeholder representations on their board.
Charles, do you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the requirement in the RCA for RPRA is that they have a skills-based board, and I think you and CCSPA have raised questions about whether that means it has to be, whether an industry representative could be a skills-based person. I think, government has heard that question. I think RPRA's heard that question, but if you want to know, what the Act says or what the requirement is, it's a skills-based board. And, I think the purpose of that is that the board is separate from the regulated community, right? So, so I think the question's been heard. I don't think it can be answered on the stage, though, today. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Any other questions? And we are still open for questions online if you'd like to type those in, but we got a few more questions here up front. Just one moment, we'll bring the mic over.
Basically, audit in the event of an audit, are you going to swoop down on every producer and audit them fully and get very granular that you didn't on this particular date and this particular quantity of goods you manufactured or produced that you didn't your pro didn't adequately dispose of them, according to the regulations? Do you swoop down and do audits?
I don't have the resources to audit everyone.
Yeah.
No regulator should have the resources to do 100% of everything. That would require a massive budget.
Yeah.
We take a risk-based approach to our verification and audit. And as I said earlier, it's absolute liability. You're either in or out of compliance based on those findings. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of how we take into account your actions in our reaction to your non-compliance.
Oh, okay. So you don't generally do audits then?
No, we do audits. We just, you asked if we audit everyone to a granular point, and that would be a lot.
Selected.
We use a risk-based compliance approach.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
And I think it'll be really helpful the next session following the break here. We're going to talk about our risk-based compliance framework and how we allocate our resources. So I'm going to go to another online question here. So some businesses are receiving the same quote from different pros, and none have provided any transparency about what the funds are specifically allocated to. Can RPRA or the Competition Bureau mandate transparent fees from pros?
Could you ask that again?
I can. In short, there's not a lot of transparency from some of the quotes from pros towards producers in terms of their pro service offering. Is there anything that RPRA or the Competition Bureau can do to compel pros to be more transparent about how they allocate their fees?
There's nothing that RPRA can do. This is between the producer and the pro to figure out. That said, we're here to help you figure out what your obligations are so that you're able to go contract for those obligations.
Similarly, these types of relationship exclusively between service provider and customer tends not to be really within the realm of what we look at in the Competition Bureau, is how is this affecting competition, and these types of situations can be a bit representative, indicative that there's less competition if pros don't feel like they have to disclose that information. But ultimately, I can't really think of a way that we can think of this like being anti-competitive conduct. Although if you're a producer and you feel like something is a little odd by receiving bids that are all the same, I'd certainly encourage reaching out to the Competition Bureau, in which case you'd most likely be directed to the cartels branch. But the transparency itself of fees is not something that, can always reach out to me. Maybe there are specific circumstances, but like on the top of my head, like this, it's hard for me to really say much about transparency of fees.
Okay, so maybe a takeaway is shop around. If you're not finding the transparency in fee setting, maybe see what else is available to you in the pro services marketplace. Any other questions here in person? Right here, Lindy.
Thank you, Dave Youssef, Peel Region. Étienne, in your earlier remarks, I think you spoke to a settling period or allowing for one. Can you speak a little bit more about that? I mean, specifically, is there a risk for waiting too long, for example, to allow for some form of succession in a new program, whereby competitiveness in the market could be impacted because the wait was too long?
That's a great question, and that's something that we kind of have to balance. And when I say that we need to dust to settle, I don't necessarily mean that just like we sit down and we do nothing for things to settle. It's more a reflection of what we hear from the market. We've in the past conducted preliminary investigations into some of these industry, and what we hear from the market is people saying, I'm not too sure what's happening. this industry-funded organization. I've been in a relationship for many years for various reasons, just to feel sure I'm complying, like I want to continue with that company. And ultimately, that type of like narrative is something that isn't something really we can act on. Now, once companies understand the regulatory framework, understand that they have options, that they can go see different companies to offer these types of services, are they still stuck with that, perhaps company that they felt like they wanted to continue with once the regulation kicked in? So we want to kind of wait a bit for that to see if it can settle in. And if it doesn't, if we're still in that situation when there's lots of dominance, people kind of understand what the framework is about, that's where we'll start to dig in and see like, okay, is there conduct now? Is there specific reasons in particular, in a situation where you're mentioning like that, we would call companies like, why are you contracting with this company? And, maybe you'd say, well, I feel like there's no other options. And this is a type of situations where we could be in touch with other pros. Like, what are the barriers for you competing in that market, and try to dig into what the reasons are for it. But in the initial stages of the transition, what we've heard is that, for kind of simplicity reasons, I guess, a lot of like the legacy framework continued on a bit. And that's not a period where Competition Act and really kind of step in and do something about that.
Okay, thanks, Étienne. We've got about a few more minutes, almost 5 minutes. Are there any other questions in the room while you've got these folks in front of you here? Oh, a follow-up?
This one is to Charles. And so in terms of monitoring, I think you had it on your slide. How do you ensure that, what sort of monitoring program are you guys going to put forward or have in place to ensure that the regulations and the program is sort of reacting to how the regulations were put forward? I think you referenced a low burden sort of reporting, auditing requirement. How will you know if that's an appropriate burden or should be changed or expanded, for example?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I guess you could go into more or less detailed on that, but I think at the highest level, maybe I think one of the key policy objectives is performance on diversion, right? So that'll take time for that data to collect. So tons supplied, tons diverted, met by the reg. That's a pretty transparent metric, and over time we can observe that, and that's a good thing for us to track. This may be a question in a sense more for Mary or with Mary as well, because RPRA has an industry advisory council, it has a service providers advisory council. The ministry sits on both of those, and we sit on the board. We hear from stakeholders and obligated producers all the time. Like, we're listening all the time. So we're trying to see how the market settles out, for that, using that term, right? So we continue to observe in that regard. But in terms of actual performance metrics, that one is very important. And then I think there's also some compliance metrics in there too, to make sure that people are meeting free riders, that kind of thing. We want to make sure that it's actually working in that regard. So Mary, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
I think it's pretty early right now still in terms of that monitoring. We're still just getting data in. We haven't even had every program yet report performance to us. So I think it would be difficult for the ministry to see if their policy objectives are being achieved with this framework for some time still, until some of this data starts rolling in. That's part of RPRA's role with the ministry, is to provide them the information they need to monitor that. So I think they're primarily doing that via RPRA.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Thanks, Mary. Probably time for one more question here. And just a reminder, some folks online, I'm just reiterating, are asking, why are my program-specific questions not being answered? And we're trying to answer questions that are more high-level about the roles of each of these parties in implementing Ontario's EPR programs. So some of those more program-specific questions, if you have them, please direct them to registry@rpra.ca. Or we will have other opportunities this afternoon for questions that might be more applicable. So any others? There's one more hand here, and I think that'll be our last question before break.
Thanks. This is Andrea from RLG. Mary, you commented that you don't vet pros. However, you are developing registry procedures to audit performance. So can you comment on how that is kind of a vetting process?
I don't think it is.
No?
No.
Okay.
It's auditing information pros provide us, but it's still not vetting a pro, right? It's auditing what the pro and the service providers are doing on behalf of the producers. But there's many components of things that pros do on behalf of producers. So it's just saying, was the data accurate and submitted accurately? I mean, in theory, one could say if their performance audit submitted by their pro comes back with issues, they probably have questions for their pro, but I'm not gonna take the pro off the website. I'm not gonna send out an asterisk that says this pro has bad performance data, none of that. It's still between the producer and that pro. The pro can continue to operate.
Okay. Go ahead,
Maybe
Charles.
just want to mention, just in the context of sort of vetting, vetting probably isn't, I think, the right term for me anyway, or that I would think about when I think about the policy intent. It is a market decision about what service provider you choose. And I would think that your service provider should be able to answer. So a lot of the questions that were asked earlier, it's not that there's no answers to those questions, it's that the market should be answering those questions, I think. And if they're not, then I think they should be directed towards the service provider. I also think there's an important element in the reg for some of the requirements have what we call joint liability, right? Where the pro and the producer are both responsible. So you're responsible as a producer, but your pro also carries some responsibility. We recognize that you have a contractual obligation, and a lot of the power for, say, collection is with the pro, right? So RPRA has then a discretion to look at what happened with, let's say there's a collection failure. What happened? And then that determines, some of the compliance and enforcement action that may take place. So I think it's important to talk to your service provider about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And some of the pros have been working on many regulations or in many different provinces. And so I would hope that they're able to speak to how they can deliver for producer clients.
Okay, thanks, Charles. So we're going to take a break now. Hopefully this, and thank you everyone for posing your very thoughtful questions. And thanks to the panelists from Competition Bureau Ministry and from RPRA for helping to clarify each of your roles.